This is the Content Marketing Podcast, episode number 70, How Fascinating is Your Content? Part 7, Trust. Hello and welcome to the Content Marketing Podcast. This is the show where we help you attract and retain business through the power of quality content. I'm your host, Rachel Parker of Resonance Content Marketing, and today is May 8th, 2014. Hello, and thank you for joining us today for episode number 70 of the Content Marketing Podcast. Just a reminder, we are live on iTunes and on Stitcher, so if you're listening to this episode on the blog, you can click on over and subscribe. That means you'll get new episodes automatically delivered to your smartphone or your iPod or your listening device of choice. And if you use a different app for your podcast listening pleasure, we also have an RSS feed, and I will provide that link in the blog post. In last week's podcast, we continued our series called How Fascinating is Your Content, based on Sally Hogshead's groundbreaking marketing book, Fascinate, Your 7 Triggers to Persuasion and Captivation. Last week, we talked about the 6th of these 7 fascination triggers, and that is vice. So if you happen to miss that episode, feel free to click on over to iTunes or to Stitcher or to the RSS feed and get all caught up. So that brings me to today's topic. Today we are continuing our How Fascinating is Your Content series by tackling the 7th and final of the fascination triggers, and that is trust. But first, let's check in with our news feed for this week's rundown of news you can use. Today in the news feed, we've got a couple of announcements from a couple of heavy hitters on the social media scene. First of all, Facebook has announced it's going to be rolling out some much more detailed analytics for videos. Now, just to be clear, these analytics are for videos that are directly uploaded to Facebook. So you wouldn't see them for a link to a YouTube or a Vimeo video. It would be just for something that is uploaded to Facebook. And Facebook has let us know that soon page owners will be able to see the number of times people clicked to look at the video. They will be able to see the average duration of view, so how long people stuck around after they started playing it. You could see the audience retention trends. So, for example, you'd be able to see if there are any spikes. So if there are any spots of the video where people actually rewound and rewatched portions of it, or you could see dips where people tended to drop off. So that's going to provide some really good information about your videos that you upload to Facebook. So lots more stuff coming from Facebook on those video analytics, so keep an eye out. They are, as they usually do, they are rolling the things out gradually, and so those will be coming your way at some point. And of course, they never specify, so we will get them when we get them. And just a note about video, as you may have noticed if you follow me on Facebook, I put out a daily tip. And what I started doing a few weeks ago is on Mondays, instead of doing a text tip, doing a video tip. And I just looked at the last few weeks' results, and I am getting about 5 times more reach out of those video tips than I am out of the text tips. So Facebook is definitely giving more credence to that video content. And of course, people tend to like video, tend to like it emotionally, and to like it in terms of the click. So just keep that in mind. Video is definitely an asset to have in promoting content on your Facebook page. So we also have some news out of Twitter this week. You might remember a few weeks ago I talked about the new Twitter profile that has recently come across the board, and I kind of described it as the next step in the Facebookification. Man, that was easier to spell than it was to say, of Twitter. The new profile is very, very Facebook-like. You can even pin tweets to the top of your profile, and it's got the kind of 3-column format that we're used to seeing on Facebook. Very, very similar. Anyway, not Facebook, Twitter has announced that this profile will be rolled out to all users by May 28th. So for now, you may have gotten a notification from Twitter that this new profile is available if you want to tap into it. But by May 28th, it will be, you will be rolled onto the new profile, whether you choose to or not. So to see what it looks like, you can go ahead and click over to my profile, which is twitter.com/resonance Cont, C-O-N-T, and to see what it looks like. The main change you're going to need to make is that you're going to need a cover image that is 15 pixels wide by 500 pixels high to cover that new cover image area. And there is also some overlap with your profile image. And if you look at my page, I'm actually going to need to adjust mine because there's some places where the profile image overlaps some of the content on the banner. So it may take a little finagling to make it work. Anyway, if you have not gotten a notice from Twitter, you can actually transition to the new layout at any time by going to t.co/new profile, all one word. So t.co, which is Twitter's domain, t.co/NEWPROFILE, new profile, if you want to go ahead and get on board. Or you can just wait until May 28th, at which point we will all be there. Okay, this week's content hit. Every week I like to share a piece of content that I found particularly useful and informative. And the hit of the week for this week is deconstructing how Mashable, ProBlogger, and Kissmetrics reached millions of readers. This is a post by Marcus Taylor over at the Venture Harbor blog. Now, you know, as my business coach always likes to tell me, success always leaves clues. And I really love reading about how the top 1%ers among content marketers, the real superstars in the field, how they've gotten to where they are today. And that's what this blog post shows us. It looks at Mashable, ProBlogger, and Kissmetrics. So 3 content marketers that are absolutely at the top of the heap. They have millions and millions of readers. But each one has a slightly different approach. And in this post, Marcus Taylor actually takes a very detailed look at how each content marketer approaches their task. And there's a great deal that we can learn from these folks who are absolutely at the top of their game. So it is a very good read, and I highly recommend it. And I will provide that link in the blog post. That's it for this week's update. If you stumble across something you think might be of interest to your fellow content marketers, please feel free to shoot it on over to us so that we can share. Now it's time for this week's Spotlight segment, How Fascinating is Your Content? Part 7, Trust. Today we're continuing our series based on Sally Hogshead's book, Fascinate, Your 7 Triggers to Persuasion and Captivation. Now, if you're just joining us in the series, let me get you caught up a little bit. So this book came out in 2010 and very quickly became required reading for marketers because it was such a unique approach to how we think about marketing. And what Sally does in this book is she goes through 7 triggers that cause us to become fascinated. And that's whether that's fascination with a person, with an object, with an experience, or with an idea. And it is truly a fascinating book, pun intended. And as I was reading it, I got to think about how we can apply these fascination triggers to our work as content marketers. So today we'll actually be discussing the 7th and final fascination trigger that Sally talks about in the book, and that is trust. So trust fascinates through familiarity and comfort. And to cite an example, and she starts the chapter on trust with a great example, and that is the movie It's a Wonderful Life. And I know those of us in the States are very familiar with this holiday classic. Those of you in our international audience might not be as familiar. But interestingly enough, this movie actually flopped when it was released back in 1946 and was pretty much forgotten for nearly 3 decades. Nobody saw it. It was just kind of locked in a vault in the studio. And what happened was in 1973, the film's copyright expired, so it became public domain. So what happened was it gave TV stations a very cheap holiday special because there was no copyright attached to it. It gave them a very cheap holiday special to present to their audiences. So those stations ran the movie and ran it throughout the Christmas Christmas season year after year. It was cheap enough because of the lack of copyright, so they just ran it. And eventually this movie just became an integral part of our experience, at least here in the States, our experience of the Christmas season. Now, is It's a Wonderful Life the quote-unquote best holiday film ever made? Probably not. But because of that familiarity that's built up through repeated viewings year after year, I mean, think about it. TV stations started running this film in 1973, and here we are in 2014, and it's still one of the most popular films that we watch on TV. So really, trust is all about comfort and familiarity. And Sally makes an excellent point in that these 6 other trust triggers that we looked at, and I don't have that list at my fingertips, but the others that we talked about are kind of one-shot deals. So alarm, for example, really elicits that fight or flight response, that panic response, whereas lust triggers physical cravings, etc., etc. But, if you think about it this way, if those fascination triggers are explosions, then trust is more of a slow burn. You can't rush trust. You can't leverage the trigger of trust in a single interaction. It's just impossible. Trust requires time in a way that none of the other fascination triggers do. So that being said, she goes on to talk about 5 pillars for building trust that marketers can tap into. The first pillar is to become familiar. And I'm going to quote from the book here, quote, "Our minds look for patterns. When we recognize them, we not only rely on them, but also develop preferences based on pattern repetition," unquote. So in other words, the more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to trust it, and eventually the more we tend to like it. And this is really where consistency comes into play. Businesses, especially larger companies, are absolutely meticulous about their brand. And if you've ever seen a branding document, this would be something that would be produced by the marketing department, or actually some of the larger companies have special branding departments. And it goes into meticulous detail about how the brand is to be represented. So, for example, the logo must be a very specific Pantone color, and it specifies, this is the web color, this is the RGB combination. And then it goes into, well, if the logo is going to be on stationery, it has to be 1/4 inch from each margin. If the logo is going to be on a baseball cap, it can only be on a certain color cap. It has to be embroidered instead of printed, etc., etc. Just absolutely meticulous detail. And that kind of begs the question, well, why? I mean, who cares if the logo is 1/4 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch from the border of stationery? But excuse me, these really seem like minor details, but it really all comes down to consistency. Now, someone would not say, oh, wow, I got this stationery with the IBM logo, and it's not 1/4 inch from the, it's a different width from the margin from the last communication I got from them. No one's going to notice that consciously, but that consistency really builds up in the subconscious experience of that brand. And that really does go into building trust, as nitpicky as it might seem. So that was the first pillar, become familiar. The second pillar is repeat and retell. So deliver a consistent and reliable message. And when you think about this, think about political campaigns. In the latest campaign, you might have followed a particular candidate, and you might be, seeing TV clips of their appearances and reading things about them in the newspaper, and you're very likely to hear or read the very same catchphrases and the very same stories over and over and over again. And there's a reason why you hear the same things over again. It's not because they lack other ideas, at least I hope they have more ideas than what you read, but it's because they're tapping into that psychological trigger that really looks for consistency, because that consistency is related to trust. And of course, politicians very, very desperately want us to trust them, and that's how they earn our votes. The third pillar is to be authentic. And quoting from the book here again, quote, "We measure how much we trust something by comparing our expectations against deviations," unquote. To put it in very simple terms, you got to walk the walk. pure and simple. You can't build trust if what you do is different from what you say. So imagine, for example, if Volvo is a wonderful example of a brand that has been consistent in promoting trust. In promoting safety. If you buy a Volvo, then that means you are concerned about safety. You're not worried about, looking particularly sexy. You're not going to take it out to the racetrack. People buy Volvos because they're very safe. So imagine if Volvo one year decided, the numbers aren't looking really good. Maybe we'll just cut some corners on those safety features. Maybe we'll use that cheaper class of airbag, or, go a little thinner on those brake pads. What would that do to its brand? It would be absolutely catastrophic, because the Volvo brand is built on safety. And if they started compromising on safety, then that trust can be lost very, very quickly. So basically, if you promise quality, deliver quality. If you promise low prices, deliver low prices. And so that's something we really need to think about when we're putting together our brand messaging as marketers. We've got to make sure it's something that we can deliver consistently year in and year out. The fourth pillar is to accelerate trust. And I thought this was an interesting take on the trust factor. So, trust is built up over time. So what do you do if you're new to the game? If you don't have years and years of communicating with people, how do you establish trust? How do you accelerate that? How do you put trust on the fast track? And as Sally puts it, one thing we can do is tap into values that extend over time. So, for example, some brands have bought the rights to classic songs. I'm thinking in particular of a laxative that uses the James Brown song, I Feel Good, because it's something that everybody knows. And that familiarity helps that brand to build trust, even if it's only been around for not very long. Another example is to hire a spokesperson. If you hire a spokesperson who people see as extremely trustworthy, then you can leverage that trust for your own brand. And that's one way to accelerate trust if you don't have those years and years to fall back on. Pillar number 5 is to unfascinate an unhealthy message. And this was really interesting. Now, if you think about the chapter on vice that we talked about last week, we talked about how if a behavior is undesired, if you're trying to discourage a behavior, then merely forbidding it, actually making it taboo, making it verboten, can actually backfire and make that behavior more appealing. And we talked about the anti-drug campaign here in the States. It was built on a zero tolerance policy. It was just saying don't, and it kind of backfired, and it not only didn't do much, but drug use has actually increased during the time period of the campaign. So, as Sally says in the book, quote, trust can trust can deter or even reverse negative behavior caused by other triggers, unquote. And she tells a great story out of a school in California. Here in the States, we're dealing with a huge problem with juvenile obesity. But the question is, what can we do about it? Now, if we try to ban McDonald's or fast food in general, well, that's just making forbidden fruit, and that there's no evidence to say that would work. But she talks about one school in California that took a different approach. Instead of telling students, no, you can't have these unhealthy fast foods. You have to eat vegetables. You have to eat healthy. What they did is they established what they called an edible schoolyard. So they turned a portion of the school's parking lot into a garden. And I believe this was in a fairly urban area of California, so a lot of these kids might not be familiar with gardening. And in this garden, kids actually grew vegetables that they would then later eat as part of their lunch. And not only did they have a period of time during the day where they would work in the garden, but that experience was also infused into other areas of their curriculum. So they would be growing the vegetables in the garden. In science class, they would be learning about the different species of plants. In history, they would be talking about different agricultural societies and different approaches to agriculture throughout the years, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really a holistic experience to introduce the kids to these vegetables that they were growing. And so, like I said, these vegetables were actually used to create the kids' lunch, and they absolutely ate it up. They ate vegetables they would not have even considered eating before, because that familiarity factor was there. They themselves grew those vegetables in the garden. They learned about them. They had learned about them in science class. They had learned about the history, about which indigenous societies across the world were growing these vegetables. So the trust trigger really came into play, because what was on their plate was something that they were very, very familiar with, much like kids growing up in urban areas are very familiar with McDonald's. So I thought that was a really interesting story to put behind that. So what can we as content marketers do to leverage that trust trigger? Please, whatever you do, please never, ever just come out and ask people to trust you. Okay, I don't think I need to say that, but, it bears repeating. That just sets off every warning bell that has ever existed. I mean, just think about the times in your life when people have said, trust me, with that little plastic smile. It just makes you want to run for the hills. So, okay, rant over. So first and foremost, we want to be consistent, and consistency is really the hallmark of a good content marketing program. So to establish trust, be consistent. Be consistent in your schedule. Be consistent in the topics that you publish about, and be consistent in your format. And every time you hit those marks consistently, you reinforce the brand that you've created in the minds of your audience. And each time you tap a little bit deeper into that trust trigger. So as you establish a schedule, as you establish a library of topics, as you establish a format, you teach people what to expect of you. And each time you hit that expectation, you tap into that trust trigger a little bit more. So consistency is absolutely paramount. Secondly, develop a lexicon of messages and, most importantly, of stories that you tap into over and over again. And, storytelling is one of the hottest topics in content marketing today. People love stories, people remember stories, people react emotionally to stories, and we need to make those stories a part of our content marketing. And we can't just tell them once and expect them to become part of our brand. We need to tell them over and over again. And this reminds me of something I heard from my friend and also my coach, Karen McCullough. She is a professional speaker, speaks at conferences all over the world, and a few years ago, she had a particular talk that she gave at different places, and as part of that talk, she told the story about how she met Sting. And, she told it over and over again for about a year and a half. And finally she decided, okay, everybody's heard this story. I'm sick of telling it. They're sick of hearing it. I'm not going to tell the Sting story. So, fast forward a couple of months after she made that decision, and she got hired to speak at a conference, and she got a very good reaction. But afterwards, when she was doing her postmortem with the meeting planner said, "Where was the Sting story? Everybody was waiting to hear the Sting story. We told people about the Sting story in advance, and you didn't tell the Sting story." So those stories that we've come to be known for, we need to tell them over and over again. Maybe not always in the same format, always in the same with the same approach, but we need to make that a part of our practice. Another example: think about music acts. Think about when bands go on the road and do concert tours. People want to hear the classics. They don't just want to hear the new stuff. When the Rolling Stones go on tour, by God, people want to hear "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," point blank. And if they leave the stage without singing that song, then the crowd's going to have something to say about that. So the stories that you tell really become part of your brand's character. So we need to tap into them often to really reinforce that brand in the minds of our audience. We talked a little earlier about being authentic. We need to walk the walk. Your content needs to reflect everything that your organization's brand stands for. So going back to the Volvo example, think about if Volvo wanted to share a YouTube video of someone driving at an insane speed down a public road. Well, that's inconsistent with their message of safety. So that's something that they would definitely not want to share on their Twitter feed or on their Facebook page. So we need to make sure that we maintain that consistency with the overall brand within your organization, and not just in our own content, but in what we share when we share stories on Facebook and Twitter. Just make sure that everything is consistent with that brand to keep that trust nice and healthy. We talked about accelerating trust by tying your content, and what we can do is we can tie our content to known entities in our industry. And an example on this podcast, I've had the privilege of interviewing some pretty big names in the content marketing world. And fortunately, these folks have been gracious enough to be guests on my podcast. So I've talked to Jay Baer, I talked to Joe Pulizzi, I talked to Gary Vaynerchuk. And by doing that, I was able to tap into the trust that they've built over the years and leverage that for my podcast audience. So just by having them on the show, I was able to add to that trust trigger. So that's my take on how we as content marketers can tap into the fascination trigger of trust. If you have any questions about today's Spotlight segment, or if you want to add to the conversation, I would love to hear from you, and I will provide that information at the end of the podcast. Next week, we're going to wrap up our series based on Sally Hogshead's book, Fascinate, Your 7 Triggers to Persuasion and Captivation, by talking about how to apply these triggers as a whole and figuring out the proportions that work well to reflect your brand and the expectations of your audience. So it should be a fun episode. Now it's time for our content marketing tip of the week. For today's tip, I want to talk a little bit about SEO, otherwise known as search engine optimization. That's kind of the left brain part of the content marketer's job, whereas the fluffy creative side is the right brain. We need to keep SEO in mind because we want our content to be able to attract search traffic. Now, I don't want to see you get too obsessive over those keywords. We've all seen that blog post that is just a jumble of popular keywords linked together and really doesn't add any value, and you can tell the person was just out to get that traffic from their search engine optimization, and we don't want that. But it is worth a little research, especially when we're writing or creating content and deciding on word choices. It's really helpful to know which words or phrases are going to attract more searches. And I'll give you an example. I was working a few years ago with a client in the medical field, and we were writing some content on kidney failure. And I did some research to see whether kidney failure or renal failure were more popular. And you would think that kidney failure would be more popular. It's a little bit more vernacular, but we actually found that renal failure was the more popular search term. And to put another interesting twist on that, I just checked it out, and actually about a year later, kidney failure became more popular. So if we were rewriting that content today, we would probably use kidney failure. But that's an example of how to use your SEO keyword research to guide your word choices. And I'm going to share with you a few helpful tools that can help you do that. First and foremost, there is Google's Keyword Planner, and the Keyword Planner has taken a lot of flack. Google used to have what they call the Keyword Tool, which is pretty easy to use. The Keyword Planner is a little bit more tricky. It's a little bit more involved. It has a little bit steeper learning curve, and I think that's because Google's trying to get people. They offer it to people as part of their AdWords package, so they want people paying for those ads, and I don't think they want the casual user overusing it. But anyway, it's still a pretty decent tool, and the information, of course, is coming straight from Google, so they are the kings of the search world. So tap into Google Keyword Planner to look up your keywords, and there are plenty of tutorials out there to help you use that. And I did a little research, and I found a list of some other helpful tools, helpful resources that are either free or freemium. So they have a kind of a basic free package, and then you can upgrade as you will. Now, I have not personally vetted these, so I cannot vouch for their effectiveness, but I did find them in a blog post by, I believe, Search Engine Journal, which is a pretty reliable resource. So I feel pretty good sharing these with you. Number one is Keyword Eye, as in EYE, and that URL is keyword I, keywordeye.com. Another word is Keyword Spy. So I've got Keyword Eye and Keyword Spy, which is keywordspy.com. And then the final freebie or freemium that I found that they listed was SEM Rush. So that's SEMRUSH.com. Like I said, I tend to stick to Google Keyword Planner because it's what I'm familiar with, and I cannot cannot personally vouch for these 3 free resources that I just listed, but they were provided by a pretty reliable resource. So I feel pretty good sharing them with you. So those are some resources you can tap into to look up your keywords, to compare keywords and see which ones you want to zero in on as you write your content. Again, please don't get too obsessive about it. It is useful, however, to do your research ahead of time, especially when you're looking at, for example, titles, or if you're looking at any really strategically important pieces of content like landing pages to promote a particular ebook or white paper. You really want to do a little research on those keywords so that you can attract more search traffic. Okay, campers, that is it for me today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Content Marketing Podcast. If you like what you've heard today, please feel free to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or via our RSS feed. And if you really like what you've heard, please leave us a quick review on iTunes. I would so appreciate it. For more information about content marketing, you're welcome to visit our blog at resonancecontent.com/blog, where you'll also find links to our pages on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and other social networks. If you'd like to email me a question to cover in an upcoming tip of the week, you can contact me anytime at rachel@resonancecontent.com. As always, I like to leave you with a quote, and today's comes from the author C.J. Cherry. She once said, quote, "It is perfectly okay to write garbage as long as you edit brilliantly," unquote. Again, this is Rachel Parker with Resonance Content Marketing. Thank you again for listening, and we will see you again next week. Take care.